So welcome, our brilliant colleague Sarah. We so appreciate your incredible leadership, and as always at Setsi, we begin all things by giving thanks to the original stewards of the various lands we're on. We give thanks to all our ancestors, all those who toiled without compassion or compensation. We give thanks to all our elders and community stalwarts whose shoulders we stand on as we build, share, and learn together for our collective liberation and sovereignty. So, Sarah, can you please introduce yourself to our listeners and viewers and share a bit about your remarkable work?
I'd be happy to, and thanks so much for having me on. My name's Sarah. I'm the daughter of immigrants, settlers to this land. For the last 4 years, I've worked with the UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose as Chief of Staff and then Head of Policy to Professor Marina Mazzucato, and now as a policy fellow there. Um, Marina Mazzucato, for those who don't know, is an economist who's written some books that I have found very compelling. I found them very compelling before I joined her team, so I was very excited to become part of making the theories that she promotes real with various government partners around the world. In previous roles, I've worked in the federal public service, including at the Privy Council office, and I worked at Mars for a while on impact investment, kind of helping to bring different community members together to mobilize capital to make good things happen in our communities. And I was a director of research and policy for a small team at a think tank based at Toronto Metropolitan University. So I'm a public policy nerd, really. I've worked inside and outside government on policy questions, predominantly looking at how we can shape economic policies and shape capital to better serve people and the planet. I fundamentally believe that these are not questions that we can deal with in separate containers. Economic policy is not something that we can do with one hand, and then we think about the environment and we think about people with the other. I think coming out of COVID, there was a lot of talk about building back better, which unfortunately seems to have dissipated. And we often hear, I think now, these terms like sustainable and inclusive growth. But the fact is that we won't get that unless we design for it. And designing for it means that we have to think about how we grow the economy, how we structure economic relationships, how the public and private sectors relate to one another in a way that maximizes public and not just private value. So that's what's been driving a lot of my work in the last 2 years.
I love that. Thank you so much for condensing all that incredible work and all the comprehensive things that you're doing on behalf of so many. It's actually truly remarkable. My next question is a perfect segue. What's inspiring you right now about your work, or what's keeping you up at night?
Well, I think what's inspired me is this like very privileged position I've had to be able to work with these incredible leaders from different countries around the world. We've worked alongside a number of leaders in the government of Brazil on President Lula's team. We've worked with Prime Minister Mia Mottley in Barbados, with Ada Colau, the former mayor of Barcelona, with a number of leaders that I think really understand that they have power to make a different story about how the economy functions real. People who are inspiring and providing space for their teams across government to work in a more goal-oriented way, in a more ambitious, creative way to make a different reality possible. And to give you a couple of very specific examples, we were invited down to meet with former Mayor Ada Colau in Barcelona. It's probably a couple of years ago. And she and her team shared with us their housing policy that had been informed by some of the work that Marina had done previously. And it was just so exciting to see how courageous and how excited about the work this team was. This was not a group of people that was coming in 9 to 5, clocking in and out, filling in, the check boxes they were supposed to fill in. They were working to make sure that every single person in that city had access to an affordable home. And that was an overriding goal that was defining how they were approaching every part of their jobs. There were a number of different people around the table that were engaged in that problem in different ways. Remember in particular the people that were involved in putting out the tenders, the calls for development partners to create new buildings, which is generally seen as kind of a boring administrative thing, and they had made it a creative, bold endeavor. They had crafted these tenders that basically said, we're looking for development partners that can build in half the time that it normally takes to build houses, that are going to build to very deep sustainability standards, and are going to ensure that the resulting homes are deeply affordable. And at first, no one responded because the partners in the private sector didn't exist. And they kind of got mocked a bit for that. And they held their ground. And eventually the market changed and new actors emerged that could partner with them on those terms. And they did. And they ended up building homes that won architecture awards globally. They also ended up getting sued by private equity and development companies, which they kind of said a little bit tongue in cheek, was a bit of a badge of honor. It meant they were doing something right. So yeah, I've met with a number of different leaders that I just found deeply inspiring.
That's incredible. There's nothing more inspiring than when you meet folks that are full of passion, purpose, and have that purity of vocation. And yeah, definitely, if you're being sued by PE, that's definitely a badge of honor in these days and times as it relates to just the level of extraction in economy. So thank you for all that candor and context. My next question is, what challenges and barriers do you face in your work, and how are you and your colleagues working to overcome some of these challenges and barriers?
Yeah, I mean, I think really fundamentally, a core challenge is helping these government leaders in different parts of the world to tell different stories. I've come to realize over time that there are a set of assumptions that are guiding how governments behave and what public policies are considered to exist within the realm of what's possible. And those assumptions are not necessary ones. They're part of a story that has been told and that gets retold about what the role of government is and what it isn't, how the economy has to function and what isn't possible in terms of what it looks like. Um, so I think really understanding that what we're trying to do is tell a different story and work with people who understand that a different story is possible and are willing to kind of be creative about embracing their role in telling a different story and crafting policies that correspond with that different narrative. I think that's at the core. There are many people with whom, I would assume that I have a lot of shared values and shared beliefs about what we want to see in the world, and yet there might be a difference in terms of what we assume is possible or not possible that doesn't always go back to like empirical evidence necessarily. You hear phrases like we have to grow the pie before we divide it. And to me, that speaks to someone who doesn't understand how the economy works or how baking works. The idea that you can kind of grow the economy like a pie, and then after you've unfairly divided it, somehow the people that have three-quarters of the pie are going to like happily give it up to the people who have less. It's just nonsense. And we know empirically that that's not how it works. That's not what happens. So this promise that after they're done growing the pie at some future date, it will be divided more equitably. I mean, I think we all know that's nonsense, but that's a story that is um, very insidious. It's kind of embedded in how people, really good people that are doing good work, it can be embedded in how they're thinking about what their role is and what's possible and what they're even considering as a set of options to help get to a different outcome. So rewriting those stories is really, I think, one of the core challenges. And one of the other stories that we often are kind of tackling with these partners who already, by the way, understand this and are trying to move the narrative in a different way with us. But one of the core narratives that can impede governments is that governments need to kind of get out of the way in order for economies to function well. And that narrative ignores the fact that government plays a massive role in shaping economies. I mean, no matter what side of the political spectrum you're on, governments are playing an active role, whether it's through putting health and safety regulations in place to make sure that the stuff we buy doesn't harm us, to providing subsidies to key industries. I mean, there's like no one who's really arguing that governments shouldn't do those things. And yet we're all kind of collectively coaching governments into thinking that they don't have as much power as they do, or that they should be minimizing that role rather than leaning into it to creatively shape markets that work better for people and the planet. So I think it's pretty exciting when governments are willing to be leaders in that regard. Um, and yet it is also very challenging because it requires working against the grain of some established truths that aren't actually true, but we think about them as kind of immutable.
Thank you so much for that myth busting and that like bizarro trickle down economics that sometimes
Yeah.
folks frame out. I think it's so important in terms of how we work in relation to each other and how we organize our economic relationships in a way that actually makes sense, you know? So I really appreciate once again, your leadership and candor. My next question is, do you have a set of key priorities right now in your work you'd like to share with our community of practice?
Sure, I can share a bit about some work that we actually just published and that we'll be continuing to take forward. I just co-authored a report with Marina Mazzucato on school meals. So looking at school meals as a tool not only for feeding kids in a way that improves their health and education outcomes, which is hugely important and most people agree with, but also as an industrial strategy tool for shaping markets for farmers and local businesses that correspond with the kind of food system transformation we really need, and that we really need from the perspective of feeding people as the world's population grows, increasing agriculture productivity, and making sure that we're producing food in a way that is sustainable. Because right now we've got a system that is responsible for about a third of greenhouse gas emissions, which surprised me, where productivity is actually declining because the impact on the climate and on the ecosystems that sustain the food that we eat is undermining the productivity of farming, and that is inequitably distributed and controlled by a handful of companies at every point in the system. There's a handful of very large companies that control a huge percent of the market. So there's a lack of competition there too. So these are problems that, as I mentioned before, that are bringing economic, social, and environmental imperatives together, and we have to approach it as such. And school meals, I think, are a really interesting, concrete, specific tool that are underutilized for promoting a change in the way we grow and consume food. It's a pretty significant procurement budget. So governments can use that procurement budget to create opportunities for farms and for businesses that are willing to kind of transform in line with the broader transformation that we want to see. Um, and I think it's pretty exciting too in a place like Canada where we have um, federated system with the national government that has just rolled out the National School Feeding Program, which is providing more funds to the provinces and territories and the municipal levels to augment what they were already doing in terms of school food programs, with the goal of ultimately getting to universal school feeding, which is a really important goal to arrive at. But I think in that context, it's both challenging and it's really promising that we could shift towards a more collaborative model where we have national level priorities that are being shaped and implemented in a way that is specific to each locality. Where perhaps you have some schools that end up with greenhouses that they're operating. I know there's some places already in Canada where the school itself is growing some of the food that is being eaten by the kids. Maybe in some places the kids are involved in growing the food or in setting the menu. Places where you've got local businesses and farms that can be part of supplying the food to the school, and other places where that might make less sense. So in each place, it could look a bit different, but in all cases, I think we could be using this procurement budget in a much more strategic way, in a way that works for kids, that works for businesses, and that works for the planet.
I couldn't agree more. I think that's absolutely brilliant. A lot of times when we think from the Canadian context around procurements, there was always this model of cheapest price versus best value. So I think that that's so important. And most importantly, I think that when you bring up that level of systemic transformation work as it relates to just food systems, it's obvious the level of relational infrastructure and the importance of almost infrastructure for collaboration to actually close those loops. So once again, thank you so much for your leadership and congrats on this publishing this remarkable work. So my second last question is, what is your ultimate goal? And what does success look like and feel like to you and your colleagues?
Yeah, so I think the ultimate goal is to get more governments at all levels to recognize their role in shaping an economy that works better for people and for the planet. Governments are elected to serve the public interest, not private interests, and they have many underutilized levers for doing that. So we're helping different governments that are kind of willing to think along those lines, helping them figure out how to leverage those tools in ways that perhaps they haven't been used in before, and it's not easy. So seeing more of that happen and more of that shift happen in practice, not just in talk. We end up sometimes engaging with governments that are influenced by Marana's work because it's fairly well known, and like this is not a bad thing necessarily. It's moving in the right direction, but you sometimes get this kind of mission washing type of effect. A book that she wrote is called Mission Economy. And Keir Starmer in the UK, for example, premised his government's platform on setting these missions with very low fidelity to what Marana is talking about when she uses the word, which is fine. Like we don't have to be religious about it, but the extent to which that's actually changing the practice of how government is designing policy is unclear. And maybe it'll get there. Uh, and maybe to give you some specific examples, this was a bit before my time, so I claim no credit, but one of the examples of what success can look like is that the team worked closely with the government of Scotland to help set up and help inform the design of the Scottish National Investment Bank. So it was a new bank that was set up with a set of goals at its heart that are oriented around um, using public finance to benefit communities. Another example would be Brazil introducing a mission-oriented industrial strategy. This was during my tenure. It was quite exciting to see. And we then kind of engaged with them to help shape a number of different kind of tools of government to help with the implementation side of that. But one was procurement, which we were just talking about. And that industrial strategy is making things like food security and net zero kind of global greenhouse, GHG emissions reduction, um, sustainable cities, health, access to health for all, goals like that have become the center of the industrial strategy. So they're seen not just as goals that are good for people and for the environment, they're goals that are also opportunities, they're market opportunities for businesses, for capital in Brazil. Similarly, we worked with Barbados. They launched 6 missions that are aiming to foster a more resilient, sustainable economy. Again, bringing growth together, like aligning the goal of economic growth with goals related to social justice and sustainability. So there's some very concrete examples of governments that are enacting policies that embody some of the ideas that I was talking about earlier. And our goal is really to help more governments make a shift in that direction.
I love it. Thank you so much once again for all those incredible examples of cross-sectorial and cross-cultural partnerships and collaborations that are so deep and needed and essential. My last question, do you have any closing thoughts or calls to action for our listeners and our viewers for our community of practice?
Um, sure. I mean, I guess I would ask listeners, as I'm sure many are, to pay attention to economic policy decisions, not to feel intimidated by experts saying that it has to be a certain way, and instead asking, I think always asking, I think it was Bentham who said this, who benefits? Because if a certain truth is being told, it may be because the person doing the telling is either benefiting from it or is being influenced by those who will. And to ask if a different policy approach, if a different economic story is possible, one that would lead to a more equitable distribution of those benefits. And I think for those who are working in government, looking for those opportunities to tell a different story, to use different words, to design policies in a more ambitious, outcomes-oriented way, embrace those opportunities. You are powerful, governments are powerful, and those rules are so important. And for those who work outside of government, I think this can mean anything from writing letters to your elected representatives to engaging in more grassroots activities, organizing to help shift these narratives, make different realities possible, changing how you partner with government, maybe even running for office. But don't believe that the stories that are told are the only stories that can be told in terms of how the economy works.
Ashe, thank you. Thank you so much, Sarah, for your inspiring work, your visionary leadership, and your remarkable solidarity. We really appreciate all that you do for so many. And as always at Setsi, we close the way we began this conversation, this interview, by giving thanks and acknowledging the original stewards of the various lands we're on. We give thanks to all our ancestors, all those who toiled without compassion or compensation. We give thanks to all our elders and community stalwarts whose shoulders we stand on as we build, share, and learn together for our collective liberation and sovereignty. Sarah, thank you so much. This means the world to me.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.